The desert wind gave no warning of its arrival. It simply appeared carrying fine sand that burned the eyes and throat. I remember that hostile silence that offered no shelter, only vastness, hunger, and a sky that seemed too distant to respond quickly. Because it was there, guided by the Spirit, that I saw Jesus' body weaken day by day as time stretched like an invisible threat. 40 days without food, 40 nights in which his stomach contracted and his body cried out for relief. And yet there was something more dangerous than hunger, something that lurked like a patient predator, waiting for the exact moment when exhaustion would turn into doubt. Because in the desert, it is not only the body that is tested, but also identity, trust, the silent question that no one dares to ask aloud, the one that whispers whether God is truly present when everything seems too empty to sustain hope. As I observe this scene, I cannot ignore the psychological weight of that moment, because Jesus was not only facing the absence of bread, but the pressure of resolving his own pain with his own hands, of proving his strength through visible means, of transforming need into immediate control. And it is precisely there that the danger becomes more subtle, because when life pushes us to the limit, temptation rarely appears as something obviously evil. It disguises itself as a solution, as quick relief, as a practical answer to legitimate pain. And in the silence of that desert, I realized that the true threat was not dying of hunger, but abandoning trust, exchanging dependence on the Father for an autonomy that seemed reasonable in human eyes, but that corroded from within that which sustained everything. When the tempter approaches, he does not do so with shouts or violence, but with logic, using his own need as an argument, offering a simple and immediate way out. And at that moment I understand that resilience does not begin with physical strength or emotional resistance, but with spiritual clarity, because Jesus responds not from the impulse of the body, but from the memory of the Word, revealing that the source of his strength was not in what could be seen or touched, but in that which sustained the soul, even when the body weakened. And by saying that human beings do not live by bread alone, he exposes an uncomfortable truth, that many times we try to survive by feeding only what is urgent while neglecting what is essential, and this weakens us more than scarcity itself. This scene confronts me because it reveals a profound spiritual psychology, showing that resilience is born from the correct order of internal priorities. When life gets tough, the heart tends to cling to what promises immediate control, but Jesus demonstrates that true stability comes from remaining anchored in that which does not change, even when everything around threatens to crumble. That is why he does not argue, does not negotiate, does not dramatize. He simply remains firm, like someone who has already decided where his source lies, and this silent decision sustains his strength in a way that the desert cannot consume. By remaining there, weak in human eyes but whole inside, Jesus teaches me that strength is not the absence of need, but faithfulness in the midst of it, and that resilience is not escaping suffering quickly, but going through it without losing who you are before God. Because in the desert of life, when everything seems to be reduced to survival, it is precisely there that we are invited to discover whether our trust lies in quick solutions or in the voice that sustains the soul, even when the silence seems endless, and this question remains suspended in the air, heavy and inevitable, waiting to be answered not with words, but with internal choices that no one sees, but that define everything. The desert doesn't change as time passes. It remains the same, silent, vast, and indifferent to human suffering, and that's precisely why it becomes such a cruel mirror of the soul. Because there, while Jesus remained enveloped by the same still landscape, something began to stir within, not as immediate relief, but as a deepening of the burden. For after hunger ceases to be a novelty, and the body learns to endure it, what remains is waiting, And waiting without visible guarantees is one of the most exhausting experiences a human being can go through, as the mind begins to search for signs, answers, shortcuts, anything that indicates that the sacrifice is not in vain. And at that point, strength ceases to be physical or emotional and becomes a silent decision to persevere, even when nothing around offers confirmation. Because true erosion doesn't happen on the first day of pain, but in its repetition, when the heart begins to wonder if resisting still makes sense. As the silence lingered, the temptation ceased to be merely an external proposition and began to take the form of an internal dialogue, subtle and insistent. The kind of thought that doesn't shout, but gradually convinces, suggesting that perhaps trust doesn't need to be so absolute, that perhaps it's possible to depend on God and at the same time ensure one's own safety. It is precisely at this point that Jesus teaches us something rarely stated directly, that true resilience requires renouncing not only obvious sin, but also the intermediate solutions that seem spiritual but conceal the need for control. Because true trust means accepting vulnerability without negotiating terms, remaining faithful without demanding immediate proof, and this produces a strength that is not felt as enthusiasm but as firmness, an inner stability that doesn't eliminate discomfort but prevents it from determining choices. By remaining there without turning stones into bread and without rushing time, Jesus reveals a profoundly transformative spiritual psychology, showing that human beings weaken when they try to alleviate anxiety by controlling the outcome, and strengthen when they surrender the outcome and remain obedient in the process. This is because anxiety arises from the need to anticipate the end, while trust sustains the heart in the present. This posture completely changes how pain is experienced, as it ceases to be a threat to the meaning of life and becomes a space where faithfulness is exercised. It is at this point that the desert ceases to be merely a place of scarcity and transforms into a field of inner formation, where strength does not emerge as an explosion, but as a deep, silent, and time-resistant rooting. This scene continues to resonate because it directly touches on the most fragile areas of human experience, those where waiting becomes too long and the absence of answers begins to generate emotional exhaustion. When there are no external signs of progress, the heart is tempted to conclude that nothing is happening, and it is precisely there that the lesson deepens, showing that God often works on invisible levels, shaping internal structures before allowing any external change. Jesus, by remaining steadfast in this process, teaches that resilience is not built when everything makes sense, but when we choose to remain faithful even without understanding, because trust that depends on explanations is never complete, and strength that depends on quick results is never lasting. Observing this silent Jesus in the desert, I understand that true spiritual strength is not manifested as the absence of fear or doubt, but as the decision not to allow these emotions to govern actions. This completely redefines the concept of strength, because being strong is not about not feeling the weight of waiting, but about continuing to walk inwardly without abandoning the source that sustains the soul. This daily choice, repeated in silence, builds a resilience that doesn't draw attention, but sustains life when all other structures fail, leaving an inevitable question hanging in the air, one that doesn't demand an immediate answer, but that accompanies the heart for a long time. Where is your confidence anchored when the desert extends beyond what you imagined you could endure? Night finally fell upon the desert, not as a relief, but as a deepening of the challenge, because when the light disappears and the cold begins to occupy the space left by the sun, everything that was merely silent becomes heavy. And there, enveloped by darkness dotted with distant stars, Jesus remained where he was, without shelter, without visible guarantees, sustained only by a trust that did not feed on sensations. For at night the body feels more, the mind imagines more, and the heart is forced to deal with what it manages to postpone during the day. And it is in this environment that the most dangerous temptation usually arises, not as an external proposal, but as an intimate, repetitive, and seemingly reasonable thought. The one that suggests that resisting too much may be recklessness, that trusting without signs may be naivety, that perhaps God awaits an initiative, and it is precisely there that true strength begins to be formed or silently eroded. As the cold advanced, there were no applause, witnesses, or any indication that this moment would have historical significance, and this reveals an uncomfortable truth about spiritual life. Because the moments that most shape the soul almost never happen before human eyes. They unfold in anonymity when no one sees, when no immediate reward is offered. And Jesus, remaining faithful in this invisible scenario, demonstrates that resilience is not born from the expectation of recognition, but from the inner conviction that God sees even when the world ignores. And this certainty sustains the spirit in a way that no external validation could. Because when obedience depends on visible return, it becomes fragile. But when it is born from silent trust, it becomes unshakable. In this prolonged silence, something fundamental is established within Jesus, something that cannot be perceived externally, but which defines the rest of his journey. By not giving in to the urgency of proving anything, he establishes an identity that does not need to be confirmed by miracles, signs, or public demonstrations. This has a profound psychological impact, since much of human exhaustion stems from the constant attempt to prove worth, justify choices, and demonstrate strength. Jesus teaches, however, that true inner security arises when identity is resolved before God, not before circumstances. This is why, even physically weak, he remains whole inside, because he is not negotiating who he is to alleviate what he feels. This silent posture reveals a principle that runs through all human experience, showing that emotional exhaustion often doesn't stem from the weight of difficulties, but from the internal struggle to control the outcome, anticipate answers, and reduce uncertainty. Jesus, by fully accepting the uncertainty of that moment, teaches that true trust doesn't require complete maps. It only demands faithfulness in the present step. This produces an inner stability that doesn't eliminate discomfort, but prevents it from turning into despair, because when the soul learns to remain without visible guarantees, it strengthens itself in a way that no quick fix could offer. There, on that cold desert night, with nothing seemingly happening, something decisive was being built, for each hour of silent waiting deepened a force that manifests not as enthusiasm, but as constancy, a firmness that does not depend on positive emotion to continue. And this is perhaps one of the most difficult and healing lessons of all history, that God often works most intensely when everything seems still, forming deep roots while the surface remains barren. And that is precisely why this moment cannot be rushed, explained, or romanticized, because it carries a question that slowly echoes in the heart of the listener, not as an accusation, but as an invitation to honesty. Who do you become when the night lingers? The answers don't come, and all that remains is to decide whether your trust will survive, even when there is no immediate evidence that it is worthwhile. The following day did not arrive as a promise of relief, but as a continuation of the same silent wait, because in the desert time does not advance in favor of those who wait. It only accumulates on the body and mind. And Jesus remained there, now no longer facing only the hunger or the cold of the previous night, but dealing with something even more exhausting, the repetition of the trial, that feeling that nothing changes despite faithfulness, that the scenario remains the same even when the heart chooses to remain steadfast. And it is precisely at this point that many give up, not because of the initial pain, but because of its duration. For human beings can endure suffering for a time when they believe that it will soon have a clear end. But when the trial extends without explanations, without deadlines, and without visible signs of progress, the weariness ceases to be physical and becomes existential, silently beginning to erode hope. Jesus, however, remains there, and this undramatic presence reveals a rare strength because he does not react with revolt, does not demand answers, and does not transform silence into accusation. He simply remains anchored in a trust that does not depend on external stimuli, showing that true resilience is not manifested in great heroic acts, but in the silent constancy of those who decide not to abandon God, even when God seems not to manifest himself in a perceptible way. At this point in the journey, temptation no longer needs to offer obvious solutions because the accumulated wear and tear does the work on its own, and the mind begins to suggest subtle, almost imperceptible thoughts, such as the idea that perhaps the suffering is excessive, that perhaps it is not necessary to go so far, that a small concession would not make that much difference. It is precisely here that Jesus teaches us something profoundly healing, that true spiritual strength does not consist merely in resisting evident evil, but in recognizing and refusing these small internal negotiations that promise immediate relief at the cost of deeper faithfulness. For it is these silent concessions that over time weaken the spirit much more than the great visible falls. By not yielding to this psychological wear and tear, Jesus reveals that obedience is not a one-off act, but a continuous posture, renewed each day, with each thought, with each feeling of abandonment. This completely transforms the way we understand spiritual life, because it shows us that remaining faithful is not a one-time decision, but a choice that needs to be reaffirmed repeatedly, especially when there are no immediate emotional rewards. As I observe this prolonged scene, I realize that much of human frailty stems precisely from the inability to sustain correct decisions over time. Many begin well, full of conviction, but lose their way when the process becomes too long, when faith needs to be maintained without applause, without confirmation, and without clear signs that something is changing. Jesus, by remaining steadfast in this seemingly barren desert, teaches that God works differently from our anxiety, shaping character before changing circumstances, strengthening identity before altering the external landscape. This requires a spiritual maturity that accepts God's timing without trying to rush it, even when the wait seems unjustifiable in human eyes. This posture reveals a profoundly transformative spiritual psychology because it shows that the human heart is strengthened when it learns to trust without demanding control, and weakened when it tries to accelerate processes designed to form deep roots. Jesus' prolonged stay in this state of trial also exposes an uncomfortable truth about our relationship with God. We often associate faithfulness with visible results, expecting obedience to quickly produce external changes. However, the desert shows that there are periods when faithfulness first produces an invisible, almost imperceptible strengthening, which will only be recognized later when tested in even more complex contexts. This is why this moment cannot be underestimated, because it is here that an inner resilience is formed that does not depend on positive emotion, but on deep conviction. A strength that manifests not as enthusiasm, but as stability. This allows Jesus to later move into scenarios of conflict, rejection, and suffering without losing himself or the mission he received. In this sense, the desert ceases to be merely a place of deprivation and reveals itself as a space of inner alignment, where the heart learns to remain whole even when everything around remains barren. At the end of this prolonged period, still without visible signs of immediate change, The question that echoes is not about when the desert will end, but about who is being formed within it. Because Jesus shows us that true preparation for life's most intense moments doesn't happen in haste, but in sustained faithfulness, in that silent decision to continue trusting even when the scenario offers no guarantees. This lesson transcends time and reaches anyone who feels weary of doing what is right without seeing immediate results, reminding us that there is a strength being built in the invisible, a resilience that doesn't depend on favorable circumstances, but on a trust that deepens precisely when the silence seems too long to bear. In light of this, the question remains open, not as a demand, but as an honest invitation to inner reflection. What happens to your faith when the desert doesn't end when you expected, and yet you are called to remain? The silence of the desert began to take on an almost palpable density, as if the very air were heavy with expectation, because after so many days in which nothing seemed to happen externally, there was an inner feeling that something was about to be revealed, not as a visible miracle, but as a direct confrontation with what lies hidden in the deepest layers of the human heart. And Jesus remained there, not hardened, not anesthetized, but attentive, fully aware that the true test was not merely enduring the deprivation, but correctly discerning what was at stake in that prolonged waiting period. It is at this point that temptation returns in another form, more refined, less tied to immediate survival, and more connected to identity, suggesting that perhaps it is time to prove who one is, to publicly demonstrate one's own authority, to force an external confirmation that silences once and for all any doubt. This proposal, although seemingly spiritual at first glance, carries a subtle poison as it attempts to transform trust into spectacle and faith into performance, something that Jesus recognizes as a profound distortion of the relationship with the Father. He understands that using God as a guarantee for acts of self-promotion is not faith, it is manipulation, and that demanding signs to sustain one's own identity is a sign of insecurity, not spiritual strength. By refusing this temptation, Jesus reveals a rare inner maturity, showing that true resilience also involves the ability not to use God as an instrument to alleviate one's own anxiety. This is because there is a profound difference between trusting and testing, between resting in divine faithfulness and demanding that it manifest itself under human conditions. This discernment protects the heart from a common trap, trying to accelerate the confirmation of one's own worth through grand gestures that impress others but leave the soul empty. Psychologically, this scene reveals how much human beings yearn for external validation, especially when going through periods of invisibility and silence, and how this desire, when not recognized and treated honestly, can lead to decisions that seem spiritual but actually stem from the need for control and recognition. By remaining steadfast, Jesus teaches that a solid identity does not need to be proven, only lived, and that true inner strength is born when we do not depend on applause, signs, or external confirmations to know who we are before God. This moment in the desert also exposes an uncomfortable truth about the relationship between faith and patience, because often we want God to manifest himself quickly to alleviate the tension of waiting, when in reality he is more interested in forming a heart capable of trusting even without visible manifestations. Jesus, by not seeking a spectacular sign, demonstrates that mature obedience accepts the mystery without turning it into despair, and that deep trust does not need to be sustained by constant interventions, but by a solid relationship built in silence. This posture reveals a resilience that does not rely on intense emotions or extraordinary experiences, but on a constant faithfulness that endures identical days, long nights, and unanswered questions, strengthening the spirit in a way that no public demonstration could. As this internal conflict unfolds, the desert ceases to be merely a physical setting and becomes a symbolic space where the relationship between God and humankind is purified of hidden interests, distorted expectations, and needs for control. Jesus, by remaining faithful in this process, shows that spiritual strength grows when we learn to trust without negotiating the terms of that trust, accepting that not everything will be explained, resolved, or confirmed in the time we desire. This lesson deeply touches the human experience, revealing that much emotional suffering stems from the attempt to force resolutions before the heart is ready to sustain them, and that the haste to obtain answers often prevents the necessary maturity to deal with what is to come. Jesus accepts the Father's rhythm, not through passive resignation, but through active trust, aware that each moment of waiting is shaping something that will be essential to face even more intense future challenges. By navigating this stage of the trial without succumbing to the need to prove anything to anyone, Jesus establishes a standard of strength that completely redefines the concept of spiritual success, showing that winning doesn't always mean visibly advancing, but remaining faithful internally, and that true resilience manifests itself when we choose not to transform faith into an instrument of self-preservation, but into a living relationship sustained by trust even when the silence seems too long. This teaching resonates as a profound invitation to anyone tempted to demand immediate signs, quick answers, or visible confirmations from God to continue believing, reminding them that there is a force being formed in the invisible, an inner stability that only develops when we accept walking with God even without perceptible guarantees. And this force, once consolidated, sustains the soul in an enduring way, preparing it to cross not only the desert, but also the crowds, conflicts, rejections, and losses that are yet to come. Given this, the question remains open, silent, and deeply personal, echoing within those who listen honestly. To what extent does your faith depend on visible signs? And what would happen if you learned to trust even when they don't arrive? The desert was no longer just a place of trial, but a space where everything superficial had been slowly removed, revealing only the essential. Because after so many days, in which the body learned to endure hunger, cold, and silence, what remained was the deepest confrontation of all, one that doesn't manifest as explicit temptation, but as weariness of one's own fidelity. That heavy, difficult-to-name feeling that arises when someone does everything right, remains steadfast, doesn't yield, doesn't abandon, and yet continues without clear answers, without immediate relief, without any visible sign that the effort is being noticed. And it is precisely at this point that the human soul tends to waver, not out of wishing evil, but silently wondering if continuing to obey is still worthwhile. Jesus remained there, carrying this invisible weight, aware that the most important decision was not about what to do, but about who to continue being. Because there are times when life does not ask us for new actions, but for an inner remaining that demands more strength than any external movement, and this remaining, when sustained in silence, reveals the deepest level of spiritual resilience. At this stage of the journey, temptation no longer needed to present itself as a concrete proposition, for it took the form of existential doubt, that question that doesn't accuse but wears down, suggesting that perhaps God is distant, that perhaps the silence is indifference, that perhaps obedience is being demanded beyond reason. And this is one of the most difficult experiences for any human being, because when pain is accompanied by meaning, it is bearable. But when meaning seems suspended, suffering becomes heavier, more confusing, and more lonely. Jesus, however, does not transform this doubt into revolt, nor the silence into accusation. He remains faithful without dramatizing, showing that spiritual maturity does not eliminate difficult questions, but prevents them from destroying trust, and this reveals an inner strength that is not built with quick answers, but with a deep and sustained relationship with the Father, capable of enduring prolonged periods of apparent absence without falling apart. Psychologically, this moment reveals something essential about human nature, because much of our emotional fragility arises when we condition loyalty on immediate gratification, expecting that each correct step will be quickly rewarded with clear signs of approval, relief, or change. When this doesn't happen, the heart begins to feel wronged, undervalued, or forgotten, opening the way for discouragement and silent resignation. Jesus, by remaining firm at this critical point, teaches that true spiritual strength develops when we learn to trust without transforming God into a system of immediate rewards, accepting that there are processes that work deeply in the invisible before manifesting in the visible, and that these processes, although silent, are fundamental to forming a character capable of sustaining greater responsibilities in the future. He understands that yielding at this moment would not only interrupt a trial, but compromise the inner foundation necessary for everything that was yet to come. At this stage, the desert ceases to be merely a scene of scarcity and reveals itself as a space for purifying motivation, where the heart is invited to examine why it truly obeys, whether out of love, trust, and relationship, or out of expectation of return, security, and control. Jesus, by going through this process without compromising his faithfulness, shows that the deepest resilience is born when obedience does not depend on immediate benefits, but on a solid conviction that God is trustworthy even when the path is not explained. This stance completely redefines the concept of strength, because it shows that being strong is not about hardening the heart or ignoring pain, but about continuing to choose trust even when it comes at an emotional cost, even when it seems to bring no visible advantages, even when the silence lasts longer than the heart would like to endure. As this time stretches on, something silently consolidates within Jesus, something that cannot be measured in days or nights, but in inner depth. For each moment of sustained fidelity without external guarantees strengthens identity, stabilizes mission, and prepares the spirit to face future rejections, conflicts, and sufferings without losing oneself. This preparation does not happen through speeches or explanations, but through lived, felt, and endured experience in silence. The desert therefore fulfills its deepest role, not to weaken, but to reveal and consolidate a strength that does not depend on favorable circumstances, a resilience that remains even when everything around remains the same. And this strength, once formed, cannot be easily destroyed by the storms yet to come. Given this prolonged scenario, the question that remains is not when the trial will end, but what is being formed within during this time. Because Jesus shows us that there are times when God is more interested in who we become than in immediately changing what we face, and that accepting this process requires a mature trust, capable of remaining even when the answer doesn't come, even when relief doesn't arrive, even when the path seems too long. This lesson transcends time and reaches anyone who feels weary of doing what is right without seeing results, reminding us that there is a force being built in the invisible, a silent resilience that sustains the soul in a profound and lasting way, and which only fully reveals itself when later on we are called to face even greater challenges without losing the trust that was formed in the silence of the desert. When time in the desert could no longer be accurately measured because the days had become too similar to one another, something new began to move, almost imperceptibly, not around, but within. For there is a point in the spiritual journey where the struggle ceases to be against scarcity, against temptation, or against silence, and becomes against the weariness of continuing to be faithful, that profound exhaustion that does not arise from a specific event, but from the sum of many days in which nothing seems to advance. And it is precisely there that resilience reaches its purest form, because remaining when there is still expectation is different from remaining when that expectation has already been consumed by time. Jesus remained there, aware that this trial was not merely an isolated episode, but a silent foundation upon which everything that was to come would need to be built. This awareness did not lead him to anxiety, but to a firm, almost solemn stillness, like someone who understands that there are decisions that are not announced with words, but are consolidated internally through constancy. At this stage, temptation takes on an even more subtle form, no longer presenting itself as a clear proposal or doubt, but as numbness, that feeling that nothing else matters with the same intensity, that faith can continue to exist, but without the same vigor, without the same commitment, merely as a habit. This is one of the most silent dangers of the spiritual life, because it doesn't seem like a fall, but a gradual emptying, a weakening that doesn't immediately attract attention, but profoundly compromises the ability to remain steadfast in the future. Jesus, however, does not allow this numbness to take hold, and this reveals an inner strength that goes beyond punctual resistance, for he remains attentive, present, whole, even when there are no external stimuli to sustain this state, showing that true resilience demands inner vigilance, that constant disposition not to allow the heart to settle into lukewarm faithfulness merely to alleviate the weight of the process. Psychologically, this moment is revealing because it shows that human beings are not only weakened by intense pain, but also by the prolonged monotony of suffering, when the absence of change begins to generate a dangerous adaptation in which hope is reduced to avoid new frustrations. Jesus, by rejecting this defensive adaptation, teaches that protecting the heart does not mean diminishing faith, but deepening it, accepting the risk of continuing to hope without visible guarantees. He does not harden, does not close himself off emotionally, does not distance himself from God to protect himself from silence, but remains open, aware that this openness is costly, but it is precisely what keeps the relationship alive, and this silent choice strengthens the spirit in a way that no immediate relief could produce. As this process deepens, the desert ceases to be merely a place of testing and becomes a space of inner integration, where all layers of identity are aligned, not only external obedience, but also the deepest desires, expectations, and motivations. Jesus allows this alignment to happen without haste, without resistance, without trying to control the pace, demonstrating that true spiritual maturity does not accelerate processes to alleviate anxiety, but trusts that God's timing, though uncomfortable, is precise. This posture reveals a resilience that is neither rigid nor defensive, but flexible and profound, capable of enduring tension without breaking, of traversing silence without getting lost, of remaining faithful without becoming bitter, and this completely redefines what it means to be strong before God. As this time lingers, something essential is definitively consolidated, for the fidelity sustained at this level creates an inner stability that no longer depends on favorable conditions to exist, a strength that remains even when the scenario changes, when new challenges arise, when crowds appear, or when rejection intensifies. And Jesus, by traversing this stage without compromising his trust, prepares himself for a mission that will demand precisely this kind of firmness, a resilience that does not waver according to people's responses, but remains anchored in the relationship with the Father. The desert, therefore, fulfills its deepest function, not to weaken, but to form a heart capable of remaining whole in any circumstance. Faced with this prolonged scene, The reflection that emerges is not comfortable, but necessary, because it confronts anyone who has ever felt weary not only of the pain, but of the waiting itself, reminding us that there are times when God does not quickly remove the desert because he is forming something that can only be born there, a silent, profound, and lasting strength, which is not built in easy days, but in long periods of invisible faithfulness. The question that remains, echoing with weight and honesty, does not demand an immediate answer, but invites sincere introspection. What happens to your heart when faith needs to be maintained, not by enthusiasm nor by clear answers, but only by the continuous decision to trust even when everything seems the same for too long? When the desert finally begins to lose its function, not because it has changed, but because what needed to be formed has already been silently established, a moment arises that is difficult to perceive externally, but profoundly real internally, in which fidelity ceases to be mere resistance and becomes clarity, as if something within Jesus were now firmly settled, no longer oscillating between expectation and doubt, but resting in a serene certainty of purpose. This transition does not happen spectacularly. It is not accompanied by visible signs or intense emotions. It manifests as a profound alignment between identity, mission, and trust, something that can only be born after a long process of waiting endured without shortcuts. Jesus remains there, but no longer as someone merely going through a trial, but as someone who has been molded by it, aware that the desert fulfilled its role not by offering answers, but by consolidating an inner strength that no longer depends on circumstances to exist. At this stage, the experience of silence takes on a different meaning, as it is no longer perceived as absence, but as a space of profound communion, where the relationship with the Father has become so solid that it no longer needs to be confirmed by words or constant interventions. This reveals a level of spiritual maturity that few achieve, because it requires overcoming the initial discomfort of waiting until trust ceases to be a struggle and becomes an inner state. Psychologically, this moment is transformative, as it shows that anxiety diminishes not when all the answers arrive, but when the heart learns to trust without depending on them. Jesus embodies this truth fully, demonstrating that true resilience does not eliminate life's uncertainties, but eliminates the need for them to be resolved immediately for faith to continue to exist. He does not become indifferent to suffering, but ceases to be governed by it, and this difference changes everything. Observing this, Jesus already transformed by the desert, I understand that many crises in human life do not exist to destroy us, but to shift us internally, freeing us from a faith dependent on stimuli and leading us to a deeper trust, capable of sustaining difficult choices even when the path is not comfortable. The desert, in this sense, was not an interval before the mission, but an essential part of it, for it was there that the necessary stability was formed to face crowds, confrontations, rejections, and later, much greater pains, without losing one's inner center. Jesus emerges from the desert not only stronger, but more whole, more aligned, less vulnerable to external pressures. And this reveals that the most effective spiritual preparation rarely happens in favorable environments, but in spaces of scarcity, where everything that is accessory is removed and only the essential remains. This silent transformation also exposes a profound contrast with how we normally deal with pain and waiting, as we often wish that difficult periods would pass quickly so that we can return to normality, without realizing that, in doing so, we miss the opportunity to be formed in a more profound way. Jesus teaches us that there are times when we must not only survive the trial, but allow it to transform us, even if it costs time, discomfort, and the renunciation of quick fixes. He accepts this process without resistance, not out of passivity, but out of conscious trust, understanding that what is being built internally will have a lasting impact on everything that is yet to come. This posture completely redefines the concept of spiritual preparation, showing that character formed in silence is more decisive than any skill developed in haste. As this cycle completes, the desert no longer exerts the same weight, not because it has become easier, but because the relationship with God now sustains the heart in a stable way. And this allows Jesus to move forward without carrying the anxiety of needing to prove anything, justify anything, or accelerate anything, because he knows who he is, to whom he belongs, and why he is there. And this inner clarity becomes a powerful anchor against future instabilities. This is perhaps one of the greatest lessons of this period, that the strength that truly sustains life does not come from quick answers or external changes, but from a mature trust that remains firm even when the path continues to be demanding. And this strength, once formed, cannot be easily removed by circumstances. Faced with this scene, the reflection that arises is profound and inevitable, as it directly touches the experience of anyone who has gone through long periods of waiting, silence, and uncertainty, reminding us that not all difficult times are a mistake or a delay, and that there are processes that can only happen when we are deprived of immediate controls, explanations, and guarantees. Jesus shows us that allowing ourselves to be formed in these spaces requires courage, patience, and a trust that goes beyond emotions, and that this formation, although silent, produces a resilience capable of sustaining the soul in much more complex phases of life. The question that remains, echoing calmly and profoundly, does not ask for a hasty answer, but for inner honesty. What is being formed within you while you wait for the desert to finally end? When Jesus leaves the desert, nothing around him announces what happened there, because there are no visible marks on the ground, no witnesses, no external records to confirm the depth of that time. And yet something irreversible was established, for he does not leave merely having endured, he leaves transformed inwardly, carrying a silent firmness that does not need to assert itself, but that sustains each subsequent step with a tranquil security. And this transition is one of the most difficult to understand, because we tend to expect that great trials will end with great signs, when in fact the most decisive experiences often end without fanfare, leaving only a more stable heart, a clearer identity, and a confidence that no longer depends on favorable circumstances. Jesus begins to walk again, now towards people, towards cities, towards human conflicts, carrying with him everything that was formed in that prolonged silence. And it is in this movement that we realize that the desert was not an interval before real life, but the invisible foundation that will make it possible to face real life without getting lost. Upon returning to human society, Jesus encounters a world marked by expectations, pain, needs, and pressures. It is here that the strength forged in isolation begins to be tested in a different way, for dealing with people demands a different kind of resilience, one that is not expressed merely in resistance to suffering, but in the capacity to remain whole in the face of external demands, the projections of others, and the constant attempts to define who he should be. Crowds approach, some seeking healing, others answers, others merely curiosity, and along with them arise silent expectations, desires for spectacle, pressures for him to fit into predefined roles. It is precisely at this point that his desert training proves essential, for Jesus does not allow himself to be molded by these expectations, does not accelerate his mission to please, does not lose himself trying to meet human projections, because his identity has already been resolved in silence, away from prying eyes, and this allows him to remain present without fragmenting. Psychologically, this passage from the desert to human interaction reveals a profound truth, for many people manage to maintain their faith when isolated, but lose it when they return to contact with external pressures, while others manage to cope with social demands, but collapse when left alone with themselves. Jesus demonstrates a rare integration, for the same heart that remained faithful in silence now sustains the mission amidst the noise, showing that true resilience is not contextual, but integrated, capable of manifesting itself both in solitude and in exposure, both in scarcity and in abundance of stimuli. This integration is only possible because he does not carry out of the desert the anxiety of needing to prove something, solve everything, or meet all expectations, but walks with the tranquility of one who knows that his mission does not depend on the immediate approval of people, but on continuous faithfulness to the Father. As Jesus begins to teach, heal, and connect with others, it becomes evident that the strength sustaining him does not stem from reacting to the needs of others, but from a stable inner source. This completely redefines the concept of service, because he does not serve to fill an inner void, nor to validate his identity, but because he is whole enough to give himself without becoming exhausted. This is one of the greatest differences between serving from a place of need and serving from a place of fullness. The desert taught him not to confuse urgency with priority, nor need with direction, and this allows him to walk with discernment, knowing when to act, when to withdraw, when to speak, and when to remain silent, without being overwhelmed by the constant pressure to respond to everything immediately. This moment in history reveals something essential about spiritual life, for it shows that true preparation does not isolate us from reality, but enables us to enter it with greater stability. Jesus teaches us that facing the world without having crossed the inner desert often results in exhaustion, confusion, and loss of purpose, while those who allow themselves to be formed in silence carry with them a strength that does not easily dissipate in the face of external demands. He does not become cold, distant, or indifferent, but remains deeply compassionate without losing himself emotionally. And this rare combination of sensitivity and firmness is born precisely from the confidence matured in isolation, where he learned not to depend on constant stimuli to remain faithful. Observing this transition inevitably leads to reflection, as it confronts how we deal with our own desert experiences and returns. It reminds us that we often want to quickly leave difficult periods behind without allowing them to truly shape us, and then we wonder why we feel so fragile in the face of daily life's pressures. Jesus shows that the desert has fulfilled its purpose when it produces a heart capable of re-entering the world without losing its center, and that this formation cannot be rushed without cost, because what is not consolidated in silence tends to disintegrate in the noise. The question that remains, echoing deeply as he moves towards the people, does not demand an immediate answer, but inner honesty. What in you still needs to be formed in silence so that you can live your mission in the midst of the world without losing yourself? As Jesus moves toward the people, something becomes increasingly evident to those who observe attentively, because the strength that now sustains him is not reactive. It does not arise from the urgency of others' needs, nor from the pressure of expectations accumulating around him, but from a profoundly stable inner center, formed far from gazes, far from applause, and far from any attempt at external control. This stability completely changes the way he moves, speaks, and relates. For there is no rush to prove anything, nor anxiety to meet all expectations, only a serene clarity of purpose that guides every decision without apparent effort. People approach carrying old pains, fragile hopes, and confused questions, and Jesus does not allow himself to be consumed by this constant flow of demands, because he has learned in silence to discern what truly matters. understanding that not every urgent need defines the direction, and that true faithfulness does not consist in doing everything, but in doing what the Father entrusts at the right time and in the right way. This way of walking reveals a resilience that goes beyond resistance to pain, for now it manifests as the ability to remain whole amidst human complexity, without becoming emotionally fragmented, without absorbing expectations that do not belong to him, and without losing himself trying to save everyone from a place of inner exhaustion. Psychologically, this posture is profoundly revealing because it shows that many become exhausted not by serving too much, but by serving from an unstable center, trying to fill internal needs through external approval, while Jesus serves from a silent fullness built in the desert, which allows him to offer presence, compassion, and truth without emptying himself. He listens, welcomes, responds, but also withdraws when necessary, not out of coldness, but out of fidelity to the rhythm that sustains his mission. And this inner freedom protects him from a burnout that could compromise everything that was yet to come. As the encounters multiply, it becomes clear that Jesus' strength is not expressed in constant emotional intensity, but in consistency. He does not overreact to the enthusiasm of the crowds, nor is he deeply shaken by the rejection of some, maintaining a rare balance between sensitivity and firmness. This balance arises precisely from the confidence matured in silence, where he learned that his identity is not defined by people's responses, but by his relationship with the Father. This understanding frees him from internal fluctuations, allowing him to walk with stability even when the environment changes rapidly. This becomes a silent but powerful teaching about the kind of strength that sustains an entire life without collapsing under the inevitable pressures of human interaction. This moment in the narrative also exposes an uncomfortable truth for anyone seeking to live with purpose, as it reveals that it is not possible to sustain a healthy external mission without a solid internal foundation, and that many emotional and spiritual collapses occur not due to a lack of faith, but due to a lack of silent formation. The kind that only happens when we are deprived of stimuli, control, and recognition. Jesus demonstrates that the desert did not distance him from people, but prepared him to be with them in a more complete, freer, and truer way. And this completely redefines the relationship between isolation and service, showing that solitude lived with God does not make us distant, but more present, as long as it is traversed with honesty and trust. As he walks among the people, carrying with him all that was consolidated in that invisible time, the resilience formed in the desert begins to reveal itself not as hardness, but as the capacity to love without losing oneself, to engage without becoming confused, to give oneself without becoming exhausted. And this way of living contrasts profoundly with how many deal with their own responsibilities, trying to respond to everything while neglecting inner care. Jesus shows us that true strength lies not in never tiring, but in knowing where the energy that sustains each step comes from, and in faithfully protecting that source, even when the world demands more than we can offer. Faced with this scene, the reflection that arises is clear and unsettling, for it invites us to look inward and ask ourselves if we are trying to live our mission from a solid center or from a constant need for validation, remembering that what has not been resolved in silence tends to manifest itself in noise, and that only a heart formed away from external pressures can remain whole when they intensify. Jesus moves forward, not hurried, not anxious, not fragmented, carrying with him the silent strength of one who has learned to trust deeply before acting, and this image remains as a sincere invitation to inner reflection. Where does the strength come from that sustains your choices when demands increase and the world begins to demand more than you imagine you can offer? Over time, it becomes impossible to separate what Jesus does from what he has become, because his words, his gestures, and even his silences bear the mark of a profoundly aligned inner self, and this begins to provoke diverse reactions around him. For where there is inner clarity, it inevitably confronts the confusion of others, arousing both attraction and resistance. Some approach with genuine thirst, recognizing in that presence something they find nowhere else, while others are bothered, not necessarily by what he says, but by what he effortlessly reveals. A life sustained by a silent source exposes, without accusation, the frailties of those who live in constant need of approval, control, or recognition. Jesus walks in this environment with serenity, without trying to soften the truth to avoid conflict, but also without hardening his heart to protect himself from rejection, showing that the most mature resilience does not avoid tensions, but knows how to navigate them without losing integrity. This moment in the journey reveals an even deeper dimension of inner strength, because dealing with constant misunderstanding requires a kind of resilience that is not learned merely by facing scarcity, but by enduring the weight of being misinterpreted without allowing it to distort one's own identity. Psychologically, this is one of the most draining experiences in human life, because when someone feels constantly judged or reduced to caricatures, the temptation arises to over-explain, to continually defend oneself, or to adapt in order to be accepted. And Jesus does not succumb to any of these traps, remaining faithful to what was formed in silence, without wasting energy trying to control the perception of others. He understands that over-explaining does not cure misunderstanding, and that constantly defending one's own identity weakens the inner center, and this understanding allows him to walk freely, accepting that not everyone will understand what he carries, and that this does not invalidate his mission nor diminish his faithfulness. As confrontations become more frequent, it becomes evident that Jesus' strength manifests not as aggression or imposition, but as quiet firmness, that rare ability to remain true even when it costs popularity, security, or comfort. He does not seek conflict, but neither does he avoid it when the truth is at stake, and this stance reveals a resilience that does not depend on collective approval to exist. For his confidence is not anchored in the acceptance of others, but in his continuous relationship with the Father. This inner independence protects him from extreme emotional fluctuations, allowing him to navigate both moments of acceptance and rejection without losing his balance. And this becomes a silent lesson for those who observe attentively, showing that spiritual maturity does not eliminate suffering, but prevents it from determining who we become. This stage of the narrative also exposes a difficult reality to accept, as it reveals that growing inwardly often distances us from others' expectations, since not everyone is ready to deal with someone who doesn't react in a predictable, manipulable, or controllable way. Jesus doesn't fit the expected mold, doesn't correspond to projections of power, nor to expectations of convenience, and this generates discomfort. But he doesn't try to adjust to reduce the tension, because he knows that sacrificing truth to preserve acceptance is a silent loss that exacts too high a price. This choice demands profound inner strength, because accepting the possibility of constant rejection without hardening one's heart is one of the most complex challenges of spiritual life. And Jesus faces it with a serenity that is only possible when identity is firmly rooted in something that cannot be taken away by circumstances. As these tensions build, something essential becomes even clearer. For the desert experience now sustains not only the capacity to serve, but also the capacity to remain faithful when serving generates opposition. This completes an important cycle of spiritual resilience, showing that it is not enough to be prepared to act. One must be prepared to suffer without losing oneself. Jesus carries this preparation with humility and firmness, aware that faithfulness does not always produce immediate recognition, and that it often requires walking solitary paths where the only confirmation comes from a silent relationship with God. This awareness frees him from unrealistic expectations and protects him from a resentment that could slowly corrode the mission. Faced with this stage of the journey, the reflection that arises is profound and challenging, for it invites us to examine to what extent our faith depends on acceptance, understanding, or recognition, remembering that following a true path often involves enduring misunderstanding without abandoning integrity. Jesus shows us that there is a silent strength capable of sustaining the heart, even when it is misinterpreted, judged, or rejected, and that this strength does not arise from hardness, but from a trust matured in silence, which allows one to traverse conflicts without losing love, clarity, or purpose. The question that continues to echo, without haste and without accusation, is inevitable for those who listen honestly. How do you react when remaining faithful begins to cost more than you imagined you were willing to pay? As Jesus' path deepens, it becomes increasingly clear that the strength sustaining him does not distance him from suffering, but leads him directly into it with lucidity. This is because there is a point in spiritual life where it is no longer possible to choose only what comforts, as mature fidelity begins to attract consequences that cannot be avoided, only traversed. Jesus is aware of this, not with fatalism, but with a serene clarity that true love inevitably exposes, confronts, and often provokes resistance. The words he speaks begin to touch sensitive regions of the human heart, revealing hidden intentions, fragile structures, and carefully maintained hypocrisies. This generates intense reactions because when truth is presented without aggression, it becomes even harder to ignore, awakening both healing and hostility. Jesus remains steadfast in this tense environment, not because he ignores the risk, but because he has learned not to allow the fear of the cost to determine fidelity. This stance reveals a resilience that does not stem from the denial of danger, but from its conscious acceptance. This stage of the journey reveals a type of strength that is rarely celebrated, for it involves continuing to love even when love begins to generate pain, continuing to speak even when words are used against those who spoke them, and remaining present even when presence becomes uncomfortable for many. Psychologically, this requires profound inner stability, because human beings tend to retreat when they perceive that their integrity begins to generate rejection, seeking to soften truths, dilute convictions, or distance themselves emotionally to reduce the impact of the conflict, and Jesus does not adopt any of these defensive strategies. He does not harden himself to protect himself, nor does he mold himself to be accepted, remaining whole in a space where tension grows with each step, showing that true resilience does not manifest as coldness, but as sustained fidelity, even when it becomes emotionally costly. While the reactions around him intensify, something fundamental remains unchanged within him, for his relationship with the Father continues to be the source that guides every decision, preventing external pressure from disrupting his inner self. This creates a striking contrast between Jesus and those who observe him, since many live reacting to circumstances, while he acts from a stable center that does not waver according to the environment. This difference causes discomfort, as it exposes the fragility of structures based on appearance, power, or control, and Jesus accepts this discomfort as an inevitable part of the mission, understanding that truth cannot be adjusted to become more palatable without losing its capacity to heal. This understanding sustains him when misunderstanding becomes more frequent and when faithfulness begins to generate consequences that can no longer be ignored. At this point in the story, it becomes evident that the resilience forged in silence now sustains something even more demanding: the ability to remain faithful without becoming bitter, even when opposition grows. One of the greatest temptations in the face of prolonged suffering is to allow the heart to close as a form of self-protection, reducing sensitivity to avoid further wounds. And Jesus does not follow this path. He remains accessible, compassionate, and present, not because the pain has diminished, but because his trust is deep enough to sustain this openness without collapsing. This reveals a strength that does not defend itself by hardening, but remains alive despite the risk. This stance profoundly challenges human logic, suggesting that the most effective protection of the heart is not closure, but rooting oneself in a trust that withstands the impact without losing itself. As the signs of conflict become clearer, the path ahead begins to take shape more sharply, not as a surprise, but as a natural consequence of everything that has been experienced so far, and Jesus moves forward without illusion, aware that the faithfulness that began in the desert now leads him to an even deeper confrontation, not only with external structures, but with the very human condition marked by fear, rejection, and resistance to truth. He does not accelerate this process nor try to avoid it, for he understands that fleeing now would be to deny everything that has been formed in silence, and this understanding keeps him firm, even when the weight of what is approaching begins to be felt more concretely. The path narrows, the choices become clearer, and the resilience built throughout this journey reveals its deepest purpose: to sustain the heart when there is no longer any way to avoid the cost of faithfulness. Faced with this stage, the reflection that emerges is inevitable and profoundly challenging, as it confronts anyone who has already realized that remaining faithful begins to demand real sacrifices, reminding us that there are times when spiritual strength is not expressed in visible victory, but in the willingness to continue walking even when the price becomes evident. Jesus shows us that this willingness does not stem from an absence of fear, but from a confidence that considers faithfulness more valuable than self-preservation. And this choice completely redefines the meaning of being strong, because it reveals that true resilience does not avoid suffering, but goes through it without abandoning love, truth, and integrity. The question that remains, weighty and honest, does not ask for an immediate answer, but for sincere reflection. What in you would need to be strengthened so that you would remain faithful even when faithfulness begins to demand more than you imagined you could bear? As the path narrows irreversibly, there is no longer room for comfortable illusions, because everything built in silence now needs to sustain the heart in the face of the clear awareness of what is approaching. And Jesus walks with this awareness without hiding from it, without diluting it, and without turning it into dramatization. For there is a point in spiritual maturity where denying the cost is no longer possible, and accepting it becomes part of faithfulness. The weight that begins to manifest itself comes not only from external opposition, but from internal lucidity. From this profound understanding that love lived to the end will not be rewarded with applause, but with surrender. And yet he continues, not by impulse, not by resignation, but by a decision rooted in everything that has been formed since the desert, when he learned to trust without visible guarantees. This journey is not hurried, but neither is it hesitant, because the strength that now sustains him no longer needs to prove itself. It simply remains. At this stage of the journey, solitude takes on a new meaning, because even surrounded by people, Jesus begins to realize that few can keep up with the level of commitment that faithfulness now demands. And this realization brings a specific kind of pain, one that arises not from explicit rejection, but from the silent distance between those who remain willing to follow and those who begin to retreat inwardly. Psychologically, this is one of the most difficult experiences in human life because the progressive separation from those who once walked together generates a profound emptiness, a feeling of advancing alone in a direction that few understand. And Jesus crosses this void without hardening his heart, without allowing solitude to transform him into bitterness or self-defense. He accepts this isolation as part of the path, aware that not everyone is called to cross the same depths, and that demanding universal understanding would be to deny the uniqueness of the mission entrusted to him. As choices become clearer and consequences more evident, something essential remains intact. The relationship with the Father continues to be the axis that organizes everything, preventing fear, the anticipation of pain, or the feeling of abandonment from disrupting the inner self. This reveals a resilience that now reaches its fullest form, one that does not depend on immediate hope of relief, but on a radical trust that fidelity is worthwhile even when there is no promise of personal preservation. Jesus does not walk towards suffering out of attraction to pain, but out of fidelity to love. And this distinction is fundamental, because it shows that mature spiritual strength does not glorify suffering, but accepts going through it when it becomes an inevitable consequence of loving to the end. This conscious acceptance sustains the heart in a way that no escape could. This moment in the narrative clearly exposes a truth that few like to face, that there are levels of fidelity that require leaving behind not only comfort and security, but also legitimate expectations of recognition, understanding, and companionship. Jesus confronts this reality without victimizing himself, without seeking emotional compensation, and without diminishing the calling to make it more bearable. He remains whole precisely because he does not try to protect himself from the cost, understanding that protecting himself now would mean denying everything that has been formed along the way, from the silence of the desert to public confrontations. This inner coherence becomes a source of such profound strength that it allows him to continue moving forward even when his heart feels the weight of what is being left behind. As this process intensifies, the tension doesn't manifest as panic, but as gravity, that feeling that each step carries a greater meaning, and Jesus walks under this weight with silent dignity, aware that full fidelity is not expressed in euphoria, but in constancy, and that true resilience at this stage consists in not retreating inwardly even when the external path becomes narrower. He doesn't get distracted to alleviate the pain. He doesn't harden himself to protect himself. He doesn't rush to finish quickly, but remains present in every moment, sustained by a trust that has already been tested in all previous phases, and which now proves capable of enduring even the prospect of total loss without falling apart. Faced with this final stage of maturation, the reflection that emerges is profound and inevitable, for it confronts anyone who has already realized that following through to the end can cost more than initially seemed possible, reminding us that the strength that sustains this kind of fidelity does not spring from enthusiasm or guarantees, but from a trust built slowly, silently, over many invisible choices. Jesus shows us that this trust does not eliminate fear or pain, but prevents them from having the final say, allowing love to continue as the guiding force, even when everything else begins to crumble. The question that remains, echoing with weight and honesty, does not ask for a quick answer, but a willingness to face it sincerely. How far are you willing to remain faithful when fidelity ceases to offer protection and begins to demand total surrender? There comes a point when the path no longer demands new decisions, because everything that needed to be chosen has been chosen in silence, and what remains is not doubt about whether to continue or not, but the faithfulness to remain until they And Jesus arrives at this point not as someone surprised by the weight of the sacrifice, but as someone who has been slowly prepared for it, layer by layer, decision by decision, from the first day he accepted to remain in the desert without visible guarantees. Now each step carries a solemn stillness, not because the pain has disappeared, but because it no longer disorganizes the inner self. For mature trust sustains the heart, even when everything points to loss. This reveals that true resilience is not the ability to escape suffering, but to traverse it without losing the essence of the love that gave rise to everything. Jesus moves forward with this awareness, not hardened, not anesthetized, but whole, allowing the weight to exist without allowing it to define who he is. In this final stage, surrender ceases to be merely a future act and becomes an inner state, a constant willingness not to protect oneself from the cost when protecting oneself would mean betraying the deepest meaning of one's own mission. This demands a strength that cannot be improvised, for it only arises from a relationship sustained over time, tested in silence and purified in waiting. Psychologically, this moment reveals something essential about the human condition, showing that the deepest fear is not suffering, but losing the meaning of suffering. Jesus, by maintaining this meaning intact until the end, demonstrates that the highest resilience consists of remaining faithful to that which gives meaning to life, even when everything else begins to be taken away. He does not cling to explanations, does not demand understanding, does not seek emotional relief as an escape, but remains present, conscious and available, sustained by a trust that no longer needs to be defended, only lived. As the surrender approaches its most concrete form, loneliness deepens, but it does not transform into inner abandonment, because the relationship with the Father remains the space where the heart rests, even when the body and soul feel the weight of what is to come. This distinction is fundamental, as it shows that it is possible to go through loss without losing oneself, to suffer without disintegrating, and to love without protecting oneself, when trust has been formed in a profound and patient way. Jesus does not minimize the pain, nor does he superficially spiritualize it, but neither does he allow it to extinguish the love that moves him. This silent choice seals everything that has been built along the way, revealing that faithfulness is not an isolated gesture at the end of the journey, but the coherent expression of an entire life aligned from the beginning. What is consolidated here is not a victory visible to human eyes, but a complete integrity, that inner unity in which there is no division between what one believes, what one lives, and what one is willing to give up. This unity is perhaps the deepest form of strength that exists, for it cannot be destroyed by loss, rejection, or pain, since it does not depend on anything external to sustain itself. Jesus embodies this strength silently, showing that the resilience that truly transforms the world is not noisy or triumphalist, but faithful, constant, and deeply rooted in love, capable of traversing even the experience of death without losing the meaning of the life that originated it. At the end of this journey, what remains is not a theoretical lesson, but a living presence that invites the listener to look inward and recognize that the strength needed to get through the longest nights does not come from quick solutions, but from a trust built slowly, often in silence, often in waiting, often in invisible decisions that no one applauds, but that irreversibly shape the heart. Jesus shows us that this trust is possible, that this resilience can be formed, and that it does not require perfection, only continuous faithfulness, that humble willingness to persevere even when the path becomes too narrow for easy promises. And so, without haste and without escape, the journey finds its rest not in the end of suffering, but but in the certainty that love was maintained until the last step. And this certainty, silent and profound, continues to echo far beyond history, reaching each person who wonders if it is still possible to remain faithful when everything seems to demand the opposite. The answer does not come as a formula, but as an invitation, an inner calling that does not force, does not accuse, only waits to be received with honesty. When everything that can be taken away is taken away, what in you still remains standing, and in whom is this permanence truly anchored?